eyes to the world of today.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, dear viewers, joining us on our second part of this fantastic discussion where we're looking at different ideologies from across the world. And the ideology of the program today is that of slavery. We looked at slavery in the States prior to the break, but now let's have a look at slavery inside of Islam. Doctor, we've had a fruitful discussion about slavery inside of the States, and we looked at the horrendous circumstances in which they lived. Does Islam have the same relationship with slavery as we discussed?
Slavery in Islam compared to slavery in other civilizations isn't really slavery, because the sources of slavery in Islam is not going and attacking people or kidnapping people from their homes or their islands and taking them into slavery. The slavery sanctioned by Islam is one when Muslims are in a state of war and they take prisoners, and those prisoners are not exchanged. In most countries they are killed or imprisoned, but in Islam they have this option, a humane option of remaining as a slave, with options of becoming of being freed. If you turn to Islam, you're freed. If a woman is a slave and she gives birth to a boy or a girl, when her master dies, she's free. There are many, and Muslims are instructed to free slaves as a kind of, as a kind of punitive act when they do for certain sins. Okay, freeing a slave in the Quran, we have no mention of taking people slaves, but we have a mention of freeing people from slavery as an act of godliness.
Okay, and Doctor, is it important to understand the context in which Islam came? The Arabs of that time had plenty of slaves. So when Islam descended to the Arabs, they didn't just come with something new. They had to change society in a slow process. Is that correct?
Yeah, Islam came when slavery was an established system that was used everywhere.
Okay.
So it challenged it by putting premises in the Quran and in the Hadith, which asks people first to take care of their slaves, feed them good food from the food they're eating. They should give them clothes from the ones they're using, should respect them, should help them in all the chores, should make their work an easy task. And that's not really slavery in the sense of what happened to black Americans,
okay,
black slaves in America.
Sure.
So basically, Islam had a very humane attitude to slavery.
Sure.
In terms of what a slave expects. And secondly, a slave is not dehumanized or is not thought to be less than human.
Sure.
It is just the facts of life that he fell as a prisoner, not that he was taken or kidnapped in normal peaceful times like what happened to African Americans and taken slaves. Yeah.
Sure. And slavery inside of Islam, just to understand the human side of it, does Islam encourage or promote or resulted in the rape or the beating or the killing or the mutilating of bodies as well?
No, Islam doesn't allow any punishments to the slave that would leave marks or that would dehumanize him or disable him. And in terms of women, they were, of course, it was not a form of rape, it was a form of marriage, because the man, there's a big difference between what women went through as concubines in America. They were raped, they gave birth to children, and no one acknowledged those children as his. But in Islam, when a Muslim man gets his slave to bed, it means that he acknowledges that the outcome of that relationship is a legal process of a boy or a girl, and that boy or girl results finally, when the master dies, results in setting his mother free.
Okay.
So it was one more thing. Getting into marriage was one more possibility for the woman to to be freed from slavery.
So, Doctor, it appears to me, like as you make mentioning, that the Islamic text, the Quran, and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, all direct towards liberating the slaves.
Yeah.
Anything, any possibility of freeing them, Islam allows to free them or encourages freedom.
Yeah, because in the Quran you say فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ, freeing a slave is one of the things which you do to get closer to God. And that is very interesting because it makes slavery disappears with time.
Okay, very nice. And also, Doctor, the point of when we look at slavery inside of Islam, we find many times that a person was a slave when he entered into Islam, but then later on he ended up becoming like a leader of an army or the leader of a particular country or a place. So does Islam allow for slaves to take positions of power?
Yeah, slaves have a greater chance of being integrated in society, because the slavery in Islam was not dehumanizing in terms of looking at slaves as less human. But in America, for example, if you're a slave, you remain a slave. Even if you convert to Christianity, you remain a slave, a property, chattel. In Islam, if a slave becomes a Muslim, he becomes a brother to the rest of the Muslim community, treated with respect, integrated and included, given rights. He has a chance of complaining in case of abuse or by his master. He can go to complain to the court, which was not possible for a slave to do in America. Because the master had the extreme or the absolute authority. He can just lynch him, torture him, kill him, beat him up mercilessly. There was no legal condition, secular or religious, that would stand between the master and the slave.
Sure. Also, Doctor, let's move over to the events of the last century so we can put things into context. We had events inside of the United States like the Civil Rights Movement. What was the origin of the Civil Rights Movement and what were they trying to achieve?
The Civil Rights Movements appeared in the 60s in response to the segregationist policies in America. It wanted the blacks to be acknowledged as equal citizens in America, because there was that segregation in bathrooms, in public transport, in places of worship, churches, in houses. You find white quarters and black quarters and so on. So this civil rights movements came against that. Okay,
talking about the civil rights movement, I'd just like to develop on that a little bit further. We have some really big names coming out of this time frame, like the example of Malcolm X, who was not a Muslim, but he was imprisoned and then he embraced Islam. He had a long journey fighting white supremacy. Could I just ask you to talk about that particular time frame and the life of Malcolm X, his achievement?
Of course, the major name that comes up with civil rights movement is Martin Luther King. But there was another unacknowledged contribution from Malcolm X, who defended black rights. When he converted to Islam, he started to disregard, to find Islam as an outlet from the racist, vicious circle that placed blacks under white supremacist assumptions. So Islam for him was a means by which he could face the racism, the white racism and white evolutionary theories, because Islam as a religion is color blind, or color isn't really important. It doesn't make you different from the others. And basically, one of the greatest early Muslim companions is Bilal ibn Rabah, and he was a black slave. He was one of the distinguished companions of Prophet Muhammad. So black slaves were not considered less human, and the condition of slavery in Islam was an ephemeral thing. It wasn't essential. Slavery in America was a matter of an existential quality. Because a slave is a slave because he is very close to is less human, according to science. In Islam, slavery was a condition that is ephemeral and that's placed between in a context where it is supposed to go away with the passage of time.
And
So Islam was trying to eliminate slavery.
sure.
And making sure, of course, that in the Quran you have an eternal message that you should set slaves free
Okay.
as a kind of an act of goodness. And the Quran continues with us. So it means anti-slavery is enshrined in the Holy Quran.
And also, Doctor, I'd like to get your opinion on another matter that when we look today in the States, we still have massive discrepancy of the whites and the blacks, with the police, white police are beating or picking up on black people. So there's still a lot of racism inside of the Western world, especially in the States. And comparing that to the last sermon of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he openly said to thousands of people that there is no difference between a black man and an Arab. They are the same. How would you describe these two different states?
Because Islam was a spiritual religion that came with a message of equality, an egalitarian message between that saw no difference in terms of color or a place of origin or being male and female. That was a strong message. And one of the tenets of Islam, that we're all equal before God and before man.
Okay.
But that's one basic thing. But in events like the events in Ferguson in America and in other places, the legacy of racism and slavery continues to affect how whites look at blacks, and how police racially profiles blacks. It was as if police acts as a slave master of modern times,
Sure.
Where he can at any time beat up and punish a black slave.
Okay.
But with not, I mean, all that was changed was just the names, but the same feeling and the same attitude could be thriving unconsciously,
Okay.
deep in the white unconscious, which motivates extreme violence when facing a black guy. They would act in a very strong and violent way, and they shoot very quickly. But when it comes to white guys, they're taking things much more peacefully than they're taking chances.
Okay, Doctor, we've come to the end of this particular segment, and I'd like to thank you very much for answering our questions and talking about the important subject of slavery, and also for taking your time out. So I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And conclude by saying Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you very much. Dear viewers, we've come to the end of this particular segment of the Pool of Ideas, where we had a look at the topic of slavery. Now, subhanAllah, isn't it amazing to see this comparison, how Islam over 1,400 years ago dealt with the topic of racism and eliminated any kind of supremacy based on color or language. As a matter of fact, the Prophet ﷺ said that the Arab is no better than the non-Arab, and the non-Arab is no better than the Arab. But yet today, in the land of the free, where freedom and democracy is portrayed, you find that the white supremacy still exists and the black people are still suffering. Let's make mention of the very famous hashtag that's running around, that Black Lives Matter, that we must take care and we must be conscious of the fact that all races are the same, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said that very clearly. On that note, we'd like to end, and thank you very much all for tuning in. We will see you in an upcoming episode of the Pools of Ideas. So until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول